Okay, so in this video, we're going to talk a little bit about how our students learn and how you have incorporated that into your programs or into your unit. So first of all, are your learning goals or intentions really clear in your unit? And then are they actually in all the resources? So if you have a slide, PowerPoint, or something that you're going to put up on your screen and show to your students, does it have the goals for that lesson in it? And do you mark them off as the students achieve them? Are there clear success criteria and exemplars for your unit that you can use to show your students what successful learning is going to look like once they actually achieve the goals and the outcomes of this learning unit? If that is not in there, it is really important that you put this in there, because these is some of the most motivational things that you can give your students, and it really helps them to focus on the learning rather than on the doing. So they want to come into, you want your students to come into your class and ask, what are we learning today? Not have them come in and say, what are we doing today? Because if it's what they're doing, then their focus is just on the actions and trying to please you. Whereas if the focus is on the learning, then they're actually a bit more internally motivated, and they're going to really focus on that. And so you can see there, the first question is, are the learning goals and intentions clear? And then the second one is, are there success criteria and exemplars? And then are these clear to your students? If they really need to be shown to your students, you just need to understand them in order for them to have an impact. So use them in your planning of your unit. You should have used them originally in your planning. If not, come up with what those learning goals are and then go through and evaluate the whole unit based on those goals. Because if there's stuff in that unit that actually isn't about achieving those learning goals, then you can take it out and save yourself some time and come up with some other learning activities to really help your students to focus in on that learning goal, the intentions of what you're trying to achieve, and help your students to be able to know what it looks like when they get there. Next, what assessments are used to identify what students know and what they need to do next? It's really important for every teacher, I think, to know that what you currently know determines what you can learn. And so we can't really expect our students to be learning what we're putting in front of them if we don't know where they currently are at. Every unit really needs to have a diagnostic assessment at the beginning of it, where you are finding out what your students already know that's related to the content you're about to do. Now, that means that you need to think about what prior knowledge is this new content really designed to build upon. You don't want to be teaching 3 steps ahead. You want to be teaching that 1 step ahead. So assess whether or not the students have the prior knowledge, and then also assess how much of the new content they already know. Because research actually tells us that students already know about 50% of what happens in the class, which is staggering when we're meant to be looking at that zone of development, that zone of learning that's just challenging enough, that's just outside of what they already know, so that they are constantly developing that learning. So make sure that you have something in your unit that is finding out what your students already know. Next, how are the connections between current knowledge and new knowledge being created? So how are you actually purposely connecting the new content that you're giving them to the old content that they already know? You need to try and work out how you can make those connections stronger, because the more you can connect new stuff to old stuff, the easier it is for your students to remember it and to make use of it when you want to actually ask them to apply it. The next question asked is if feedback is given that is both timely and effective. So this means that feedback needs to come at the time that the students need it, and it needs to be focused on or differentiated for your students and where they're at. So if your student is very new to the content, and then they need feedback on whether the content is correct or incorrect. As your students become more familiar with things, you want to move them into feedback that is more targeted on the processing and how they've gone about putting pieces of information together and making those connections. And then the last bit of feedback for the people who really are getting the content and are doing decent bits of connecting is you want to actually help them to be more self-monitoring. And so that's where your criteria and your exemplars come in, and your learning goals. And it's also where you start to really help them to make the connections beyond what's happening in your classroom to real life and to other subject areas. Next question says, are there diagnostic, formative, and summative assessments to check student learning and identify teaching and learning gaps to be strengthened? So one of the key things that we need to remember is that all the assessments that we do, whatever they are actually for us as teachers so that we can adjust our practice. It is not for the students to know, oh, look, I got 80%, that's great. It's actually for us to know where their gaps are and how we can fill that in. And so that means that it's important that your unit actually has some flexibility within it, so that if students get things quickly, you can speed up, or that you can go in more depth, or you can go a bit more broad. But if students are really struggling, then you need to go back and reteach it. And so what things are in there, what aspects or learning activities in your unit where you've clearly put in that says, actually, if students struggle with this concept, which often happens, then these are the types of things we're going to do to reteach it and to really help the students who struggle to get the content to get it and to get it well. So it's one thing to have the diagnostic, formative, and summative assessments in there, but it's another thing to then build in the time to actually reflect and make adjustments based on the data that you get from that. And that's why it matters. If you're not making the adjustments based on the data you're getting, then there's no point really in doing those types of assessment anyway. The next question asks, what is the justification for the structure and organization of this unit as a whole, and does it promote learning? So what this means is, are the foundational skills and concepts at the beginning, those things that are prior knowledge and that you're going to build upon throughout this unit, are they at the beginning, or are they halfway through or at the end? Do you have something at the beginning of the unit that actually requires the students to know something else that you're not going to teach for 3 weeks? If that's the case, then you need to go through your unit and restructure it. Okay, this is also where you want to think about clustering content. So is there bits of content that you've just put in there because this is the way the syllabus lays it out, one dot point after the other, but actually there's 2 dot points that relate really well together, and you could really integrate them nicely to improve the learning that's happening, because you want to structure things that helps learning, not just that helps you to tick off the boxes to show that you follow the syllabus perfectly. The next question asks, for content that has lots of parts or is really complex, those bits that are really hard to understand in your content area, what strategies are being used to reduce the cognitive load on your students? If something is really hard to understand, it takes a lot of brain power, and if you're giving them lots of different content all at once, if you're going through really quickly, your students aren't going to learn it because they're going to get brain overload and just kind of turn off. So the whole idea of maybe slowing down, instructing your students to pay attention to this bit because it's super important, teaching them how to take notes properly, helping them to get a bit more coaching or to reread sections. They're the kinds of strategies that you might use to help reduce the cognitive load. If something is difficult to understand, you might have them read a paragraph and then discuss it, and then read another paragraph and discuss it. Or you might have them read the paragraph 2 or 3 times and then discuss it. Have them highlight it and make notes on it. Have them take their own notes, trying to create a summary of it, and then discuss that with someone else, so that you're really trying to reduce that cognitive load. And one of the great ways of reducing cognitive load is actually to have collaborative tasks built in, because that social connection and that social learning actually helps to reduce the cognitive load for the student. Continuing on to our next page, the next question asks, are activities chunked into less than 20-minute blocks with controlled transitions between activities? So here it's important that you understand that working memory only lasts between 5 and 15 minutes before it begins to really fatigue and struggle. So we don't necessarily notice this, but I guarantee that if you've thought about it, if you go back to the last time you were sitting in a lecture, even if you were really intrigued by this lecture, I guarantee that there were times while you were sitting there, if this lecture was an hour long, that you drifted off, noticed that you were thinking about something else, and then came back to that lecture and refocused. And that happens pretty much every 20 minutes for an adult, and it takes less time for students to do that with their thinking. And so if you are presenting information in particular, you want to keep that in as short a time period as possible, but you also want to make sure that you're doing this with your activities. So maybe building in 20-minute activities and having them change, and make sure you've planned the transition between those activities. Don't just have in your program, we're going to do a reading and then we're going to do a class discussion. How are you going to transition from the reading to the class discussion? Are you going to transition from, okay, once you finish the reading, I want you to go back to your desks and reflect and write some notes, and then write some questions down that we're going to use in our discussions. And so you actually have that transition happening where they've read it, they're now making some notes on their own, getting ready for the discussion that they know is coming. Whereas if you just kind of say, okay, read the story, and then after a while you then say, all right, let's have a class discussion, that transitioning from reading, there'll still be someone who's reading or people who have finished reading earlier than other people. You need to make sure that you've catered for that in your program and how you're thinking about what's happening. The next question is spaced repetition clear in the program? Now, if you don't know what spaced repetition is, it's that idea of, I learned something in week 1, I then need to revise it in week 2, revise it in week 4, revise it in week 8, And so you're constantly going back to old content to make sure it's still fresh in the student's memory and that they can still retrieve it, that they've still learnt it, and that they haven't forgotten it, they haven't stored it away somewhere where it's no longer retrievable. And so spaced repetition is really helpful to do that. And so you should be looking within your whole, it might be in your scope and sequence, but also throughout your units, where are you putting in that spaced repetition to make sure you're going back and revising the content that the students have covered earlier. Okay, so the next question asks, which teaching strategies are used to develop the list of learnings that are below? Now, all of these should be present throughout a unit or a program, but not necessarily used in every single lesson, but they should be there and they should be developed. Now, this is really important because I often look at programs and provide people with feedback, and the number one spot where this really comes up is for problem solving. So as you go through your program or your unit, you should evaluate and check that you are actually teaching them some kind of knowledge, that you are developing their skills somehow, and actually giving them that the teaching around that. So if you're teaching skills, you might model the skill, give them a chance to practice it, give them feedback on their practice and refine that practice in terms of their skill development. Now, often when it comes to problem solving, teachers don't do this. Teachers just kind of give a problem and go, okay, here's the problem, I want you to solve it. And they don't help the student to learn the skills involved in problem solving. Just because you have a problem that's set up in your lesson does not mean that you've used any teaching techniques to develop students' problem solving. Okay, so you want to make sure that if you are doing some problem solving, that you actually have something in there that is teaching students how to solve problems as well. Now, at some point, that will mean just giving them the problem and letting them go for it because you would have already given them that instruction, or maybe they're senior students, and so hopefully they've already developed a lot of those skills already. But you still need to think about how you can take their problem solving skills to that next level. The same goes for critical and creative thinking. This is not just a chance to be critical or to be creative, it's actually you teach them how to be critical and helping them to be creative. You want to make sure that in your program you have those things present in terms of teaching strategies that develop these in your students. Next, it asks which of the following techniques can be identified and used to help students commit knowledge to memory. Now, these are basically memory techniques. These come from Hattie and Yates's book about visible learning and how we learn. So they talk a lot about these techniques, which basically help us to remember the content so that we can apply it better later. It's simple things like rehearsal, so repeating, refreshing, and reciting stuff that they've learnt, chunking content together that is related to each other, using imagery. We can also use mnemonics, so rhythms, acronyms, etc., or we can use elaboration, and that's where you're really adding meaning to what the student is learning. So making those real world connections for your students, connecting it in with their interests is what actually will help them here to recall and store in the information and do it well. And these things need to happen at the point when they are first exposed to the content. So this is not stuff that you just do later. You need to do this at the first exposure, and then you can also use it later, but you need to do it at that very first day when you're teaching the content as well. The next question for how students learn asks what strategies are used to help students to self-evaluate activities. So when we're having a look at goal setting and success criteria, are the students actually then using those types of things to do some kind of self-evaluation in terms of how they're progressing with their learning? Are they looking at worked examples? And those worked examples maybe even at multiple levels. So this is a beginner's level example, and here is the next step example, and the next step example, and then here is the best example that you could possibly do as a teacher for where they might get to. You might even have your kids do some journaling or do some kind of, I actually like to use Google Forms and have the outcomes listed there and have my students make comments about how they think that they're going in relation to those goals or those outcomes. And I might even include some of the criteria or the exemplars in there or linked from the form for them to look at and remember, okay, so am I at that level yet? Not quite. I think I'm still 2 steps below where I need to be. And so I need to work on these things as I move forward. And that just helps the students to develop those skills that are needed for that lifelong learning for their future. The next question asks, can the following be identified for each bit of content? So as you're going through content, you want to make sure that you are actually putting in some kind of initial review. What are they going to learn as we go forward? there should be some kind of formal presentation, whether that be a video or it could be them reading an article, reading a bit of a textbook. It could be them reading something online. It could be them watching a movie if it's something that you're doing in English where you're examining video techniques or something. So some kind of formal presentation that goes on there. Then there's some guided practice around you basically modeling to the students what they're going to be required to do, providing them feedback as they follow you in that practice. And then they do some independent practice, and then you also are providing further follow-up and further review. And so within your whole lesson flow, these should essentially exist for each bit of content or across a couple of pieces of content if they link and chunk together really well. And so have a look through and see where these things are missing in your unit and how you might actually go back through and help students. If you're, for example, missed actually providing guided practice, you might want to go back and just, okay, I need to include in this lesson somewhere where I actually am modeling to the students what they need to achieve. And then the last question asks, where are the opportunities for parents and carers to be involved? Now, this is here because this will actually really help your students to make that meaning, to make those connections to real world. So if you can have parents be guest speakers, or you can have your students go back home and talk to their parents or their carers about anything that's going on in class, and maybe you can have them survey them and bring that information into class as data that you're going to use and analyze as a class. Find those connections that exist into their real world, and parents can be a really great way to make those nice connections. Well, that's it for this video. Next video that will be coming your way, we'll be looking at the differentiation aspect of this template.